where do we get our morals? Let me introduce myself. I am John Nightingale, a retired Church of England vicar and the brother of Simon Nightingale, one of the speakers, and the other one is Peter Bellingham. We shall say more about them a little bit later on. Thank you, by the way, to all those who have not taken up seats and who are standing, and should we have any other people who are coming in, and should they look the sort of people who really do need the seats, perhaps those who are a bit stronger, you can point it out, or some people may even sacrificially give up a seat. Please, if you have mobile phones, would you turn them off? Now, as to the format of the meeting, the main speakers will each speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a short pause, about 5 minutes. People can stretch if they want, or reflect, or talk to one another. And then we will have questions, and then Peter and Simon will each say a few concluding words. Simon and Peter are neighbours and friends who enjoy philosophical chats over coffee and cake. They have found that their moral views are similar, despite very different worldviews. At the end of the day, they converge on many important issues, but get there from different starting positions. So tonight is a discussion. It's not an adversarial debate. There aren't winners and losers. It's a discussion to help Christians understand the basis of humanist morality and vice versa. And I would add, it's something to help each of us in our life journey. Hopefully somebody will tell us when we get the parliamentary vote coming in to put people out of their misery or add some gloom to the proceedings. To me, it indicates that in our country there is such a need for values and for people being able to get on together, even if they do disagree or see things differently, to have something that we can all work with. So maybe we can set an example to Parliament tonight. Now, there are tabletop exhibitions there about Shropshire Humanists and also the Well, which is Peter's church. And do go and have a look at there and look at the stuff. And, of course, right at the end, don't feel you have to rush away, because the two main speakers will be around and very happy to talk to you if you have questions that you've not yet had an answer to. Peter is a pastor at the Well, the Christian church in the town centre in Shrewsbury. From age 8, he was a choir boy at Exeter Cathedral, where he embraced agnosticism. He did not come to a living faith in Jesus Christ until the age of 12. Once he had asked Christ to live in his heart, he found he was able to forgive those he had previously hated. After studying English at Oxford University, he was a civil servant for 9 years. Then he moved with his wife Joy and their 3 young children to Honduras in Latin America, where they lived and worked there for 8 years. He managed volunteer medical teams with an NGO that serves the very poor, and planted a church which continues under Honduran leadership. Joy assisted him and homeschooled their children. Since they returned in 2009, Peter has continued to write for atheists, agnostics, people of other religions and Christians, to speak in secular and church settings and to converse with thousands regarding faith in God. You may have seen him preaching on Pride Hill, or even had a conversation with him on the streets as he shares the message of Christ. If you haven't, please do approach him and chat when you see him out there. His mother was Polish, and although he doesn't speak the language, he is sometimes a speaker at events organised by the local Polish community. Recently he gave a talk on dehumanization and on the special significance of Polish Independence Day. His wife Joy is a homemaker, an artist, and assists him at church. Their son Josh works at Nando's, having completed a degree in political science and Spanish. Their son Tom is doing a master's in computing at Imperial College London, and their daughter Amy makes excellent coffee as a barista in a Costa coffee shop and is soon getting married to Jacob. Peter enjoys conversation, making or listening to music, and watching well-made films. He considers himself fortunate to be neighbours to the Nightingales, and particularly fortunate that it's a cold winter, so that when he looks out from his top window, he won't see Dr. Nightingale sunbathing.
You should be so lucky.
Whereas Simon Nightingale is a recently retired clinical neurologist at the Royal Shrewsbury Hospital and senior lecturer at Keele. Brought up in the Church of England, he lost his faith in his late teens and for many years called himself an atheist, but for the last 15 years he's been a humanist. He has lived in Shropshire for almost 30 years. His children are Sam, a doctor in Africa, Daisy, a mathematician who turns her hand to anything and currently works for Reuters, Alice, a research nurse, and Joe, who is trying to persuade the building industry to comply with climate change targets. His wife, Bridget, is the homemaker responsible for any success by her husband and children. For some years, Simon has lectured on neuroscience and philosophy, theology and humanism. He has led discussions on various issues such as the biological basis for empathy, how religion and medicine can conflict, assisted dying, normative ethics, moral foundation theory, spirituality, and what makes us happy. He is a member of our local SACRE, which oversees RE in Shropshire State Schools. He talks in local schools about humanism and normative ethics. He gives regular talks on Radio Shropshire's Sunday morning religious affairs programme. He also regularly conducts funerals for those who live their lives without religion. He is an active member of Shrewsbury Interfaith Forum and chair of Shropshire Humanists. His main hobby is designing and making ingenious mechanical puzzles. He considers himself to be fortunate to live next door to the Bellingham family, and I'm very glad to have him as my brother, somewhat overawed by the achievements of all both these people and their families. But let's get started, and let me have a coin. Could I have a coin, please? Thank you very much indeed. It's about who's to start first. If it's heads, it's Simon, and if it's tails, it's Peter. And it is tails. Yes? Tails. Right, so Peter, you start first.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out this evening to join us here. Hope it's going to be a really enjoyable evening for everyone that's come. When we get to the question and answer session, please do feel free to ask whatever you want. There's no taboos this evening. It's such a joy to be here in discussion this evening with my friend and neighbour, Simon Nightingale. I love talking with Simon. We've spent many hours in very lively conversation, and I look forward to many more. My first contact with Simon was indirect. My wife and I were living in Honduras when my mother-in-law Jill was diagnosed with motor neurone disease. As her condition worsened, Simon went out of his way to find a place for her at the hospice. And this wasn't a one-time kindness on Simon's part. When I told an elderly friend that I'd be debating Simon, she said she'll never forget his kindness in seeking her out at the hospital when her son was being treated there for severe epilepsy. Humanists want to promote care for others, and from my experience, Simon shows the type of kindness that's worthy of the name. Tonight we're discussing where we get our morals from, or how do we know what's the right thing to do. Not as an academic exercise, interesting though that would be, but rather to see if there's something we need to realise so we can do a better job at running our lives and running the world. So what is morality? It means the distinction between right and wrong. A moral person typically makes a distinction between right and wrong and lives according to what's right. An immoral person makes the distinction but lives according to what's wrong, and an amoral person makes no distinction between right and wrong. So why do we make a distinction between right and wrong? Simon and I have different starting points on this. He thinks that morality is a human construct deriving from our evolution as social animals. In other words, consciously or unconsciously, we make it up because we need to be able to get on reasonably well with each other. I think morality was given to us by God, who is himself moral. He created human beings to get on well with him and with each other. So how can we tell right from wrong? Simon and I agree that morality helps people to get on well with each other. To use more technical terms, it conveys a community advantage and therefore a personal advantage. So we could happily substitute the word right for advantageous and wrong for disadvantageous. If it's right, it's advantageous, it works. If it's wrong, it's disadvantageous and it doesn't work. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy, which is quoted on the Humanist UK website, says this: "Humanist ethics is distinguished by placing the end of moral values in the welfare of humanity rather than in fulfilling the will of God. But there's no need to make a distinction there. In Christianity, the welfare of humanity and fulfilling the will of God are inseparable. I hope to demonstrate this evening that when God gets what he wants, mankind flourishes." As we've seen, morality means to distinguish right from wrong, good and bad. Everyone does this. Everyone in this room and everyone on the planet has morals of some kind, because everyone distinguishes between what they think is right and what they think is wrong. As Simon rightly points out, most people agree on the basics, that it's right to consider the needs of others and not just your own. The golden rule of consider others and not just yourself. Treat others as you wish to be treated. But you've probably noticed that we have a surprisingly well-developed ability to detect other people's moral shortcomings more than our own. This is why we get so easily affronted when we think someone else isn't treating us fairly. If we think someone should be treating us better than they seem to be doing, we move very quickly into criticising them. The positive things about them flee into the background, and their failure fills our view. Just stand in line at a coffee shop and watch as the barista receives a tongue lashing for serving Miss Perfect a broken piece of cake. It just doesn't seem to matter to Miss Perfect that the barista is tired, having worked long hours, and still manages a smile for every customer. Or that broken cake is just as nutritious as unbroken. Or that it's a privilege to even eat cake when half the world is hungry. Because what really matters to Miss Perfect is that she's paid £2.50 for her cake, and not a penny less, and she expects her cake to be no less perfect than she herself is. And there we go. I've just pointed out Miss Perfect's faults. What about my own? Well, I don't have any. Joke. My wife kindly does my washing for me. I love my wife. I deeply appreciate all that she does and how hard she works. And typically, I'm not one to criticise her. Yet, hey presto, the other night, when I didn't know where my clean T-shirts had gone after she'd washed them, I felt that sense of injustice rising up. Why couldn't she have done a better job? I asked her where they were. She told me where she thought she'd put them. As I left the room to look, I didn't give her a tongue lashing. I don't do that kind of thing. Instead, I withheld my usual heartfelt thank you until I'd been to look to see if they were indeed there. My silence was a jab at her. The problem is, once I'd found out that they were indeed there, I knew I'd mistreated her, albeit subtly. My guilty conscience quite rightly kicked in. I knew that a late thank you would ring a bit hollow, if not to her, then certainly to me. Oh, we all have a sense of right and wrong. Whether we are husbands looking for clean washing, grown-up children screaming it's not fair, or Hitlers stirring up national hatred towards whole people groups, we all agree that others should treat us properly. Maybe our washing should always be put back in the right place. Maybe our cake should always be unbroken. Maybe Germany was mistreated at Versailles, but that's just not the point. How quickly we forget the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. We forget the golden rule precisely because it's a rule. Rules alone cannot change people. They just don't have the power, because we just don't have the power. Like the rules of physics or the rules of maths on their own, morals can do absolutely nothing. They just describe what should happen. In the case of physics and maths, they describe what should happen based on observation of what usually does happen, or always happens, as far as we can see. We deduce the apple will always fall from the tree, whether far from it or near to it. We don't exactly know why, but we know that gravity is a rule. In the case of right and wrong, rules describe what should happen based on what we know in general terms to be best for human well-being. Community advantage. It's generally better not to lie, steal, cheat, or murder. As we've seen, we all are much more ready to invoke that rule when we're being lied to, stolen from, cheated, or murdered, rather than when we are lying, stealing, cheating, or murdering. But at some point, normally the pigeons come home to roost, and we realise that we've done wrong too. We may be pretty good at switching off our consciences, at firing up the engines of our self-justification or just keeping them permanently ticking over. But our innate sense of right and wrong is ultimately impartial. Like the law of gravity, it doesn't have favourites. For all the hundreds of varieties of apples that Britain is blessed with, not one of them remains suspended in the air when it becomes detached from the tree. They all fall, and so do we. The rule book is there, written on our hearts. And it may be enough to show us others' faults and even our own, but it's not enough to make us good. In fact, it can do quite the opposite. Where does that rule book in our hearts come from? Is it from religion? If so, then the word hypocrisy leaps to mind. Why is it that religious people are often the best at pointing out other people's faults? After all, it was the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, who murdered Jesus Christ, or at least arranged for his murder. The day job of the scribes was to teach the rules, to teach the law of Moses, to make sure people knew what they should do and what they shouldn't do. The Pharisees' day job was to apply that law to absolutely every little detail of everyday life. I say it was their day job because for the most part they failed spectacularly to actually apply the law to their own lives. Oh yes, they did all the right ceremonies, but they fell far short of the golden rule. They were the moralists of their day. And they mocked as they watched that man Jesus, who'd been tortured all night, die in agony nailed to a piece of wood. Their sophisticated rule book clearly wasn't anywhere near enough to stop them regarding themselves as angels while acting like monsters. They knew well their moral ABCs, don't lie, steal or murder. But they lied about Jesus, they stole his liberty and they murdered him, all the while convincing themselves they were doing the right thing. It certainly was right in their own eyes. Once again, I'm pointing out other people's faults, but I should remember it was the secular authorities and the general population that joined in to send Jesus to his death. Jesus had done great kindnesses for many people. They all knew right and wrong, but clearly it wasn't enough to know right and wrong. I too am part of the general population, and if the scenario was repeated today, how do I know I wouldn't also be in that crowd, calling out treacherously for this good man to be silenced? Having a moral sense, knowing right and wrong, clearly just isn't enough. Let's talk about the cure for insanity. G.K. Chesterton defined insanity as being fixated on one fact and thus ignoring the bigger picture. Thus, it was insanity for me to fix my mind on my wife's apparent failure to properly locate my clean washing, rather than let it dwell on her incredible kindness and hard work in cooking and cleaning for me, and above all loving me throughout our 25 years of marriage. It was insane for me to forget in that moment that she was utterly exhausted because she'd spent herself recently taking care of unwell people and animals in our house and other unwell people from our church. It was insane for me to take my own view on what is good and bad rather than take the bigger picture. God has been trying to make this point to mankind from the very beginning. Whether you take the book of Genesis literally or metaphorically, read the first few chapters, and you'll find that the only tree that God forbade Adam and Eve to eat from, out of the many, many he gave them in that luscious Garden of Eden, was the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Knowledge itself is not bad, but this was a certain kind of knowledge. We're told that from the start they were naked and unashamed. This first husband and wife were enjoying pure, uninhibited, wholehearted intimacy of body and soul, perfect trust, and therefore perfect vulnerability. God wanted them to continue this way, to really live. He didn't want them focused on good and bad. He didn't want them taking their own view on good and bad. He knew that would kill them, and he told them so. They made that fateful decision to ignore him and eat from it, and we're told that immediately their eyes were opened and they saw they were naked. They quickly made fig leaves to cover up their newfound sense of shame, to hide from God, from each other, and from themselves. Then, when confronted on their error, they began to blame each other and even blame God for putting them with each other in the first place. We can all relate because the history of mankind, you and I included, has been the same ever since. Pretending, hiding, blaming. I'm not suggesting we dispense with our clothes, but it certainly would help if we could dispense with our masks and our pointing fingers. As the song goes, We learn to wear these masks so young, like a prison that keeps joy from getting through, and an angry silence grips our tongues. These weapons and these walls become our tombs. How can we drop those masks and weapons and come out from behind those walls if we're afraid of what being vulnerable will mean? Why would we want to look God in the eye if we think he's waiting to condemn rather than help us? God is moral, but he's not a moralist. There are things that are right and wrong. Adam and Eve knew they were not meant to eat from that particular tree, but they were free to eat from all the others. God had told them so. We all have a basic moral conscience. We know there's a right way to live and a wrong way. Whether God placed it there in us from the start, or whether he gave it to us through evolution, I will not contest. The important thing is that it's there. But it's developed in completely the wrong way. We think our moral conscience is about figuring out what's right and doing it, and figuring out what's wrong and avoiding it. The knowledge of good and bad. But that's not what it's there for. It's there simply to keep us oriented towards God, like a compass drawn to the north. The rest follows naturally, powerfully, and beautifully. At the beginning, there was only one negative command that Adam and Eve needed to heed. The other commands that God gave at the beginning would have, let's just say, come naturally. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. In other words, steward over this wonderful creation. Enjoy one another and enjoy having children who you teach to do the same. So why later on did God add another 600 or so commands by giving the law through Moses? Thus providing an environment for moralists, for scribes, for Pharisees. If you read the Bible through and you follow the development of the narrative, the answer is crystal clear. The moral law was not given to teach people to do right and avoid wrong, but rather to show that a rule book is not enough. It just doesn't go far enough. Moral rules can never cover all bases. And it's not basic enough. Rules don't give us the ability to keep them. They may be somewhat effective motivators, good clarifiers of what kinds of behaviour are beneficial and which aren't. But principally the law was given to show that we can't keep it. It condemns us. It doesn't save us. We don't need a rule book. We need something else, something much more basic, something much more natural, much more alive. We need a relationship. I don't need a rule book to tell me that when I deliberately withheld that thank you from my wife, I was wrong. Deeply, horrendously wrong. I don't need a rule book to tell me that she deserves much more than a thank you. I love her, and I know she loves me. We have a relationship of love with each other. That's why I knew my error. That's why I'll make a point of acting differently next time. But I will need help. Another tree that's mentioned in Genesis that Adam and Eve had been free to eat from but sadly never did was the tree of life. They and all their descendants ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad rather than this tree of life. That's why the religious leaders, the teachers of the knowledge of good and bad, murdered Jesus. Because Jesus had showed them that having tasted the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, we're condemned to eat it all, and every bite brings death. Jesus showed them clearly just how far the law of good and bad goes. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer. Whoever even looks at someone else's wife lustfully is an adulterer. No one escapes that degree of scrutiny. Thus, morality rightly condemns even its own teachers to death. They had to silence Jesus because he came not to make bad men good, but to make dead men live. And so he was putting the teachers of the law out of a job, ending their ministry of death. His words ring right across the ages. I have come so people can have life in all its fullness, because I am the life. He would fulfill all moral law on our behalf, yours and mine. He would die our death for us and be raised for us to new life, thus undoing the effects of Adam's sin and ours, and beginning a new species of people who would live not by the knowledge of good and bad, but by the power of God's own life. The law of Moses, the law of good and bad that the religious leaders were tasked with teaching, condemned an adulterous woman to death by stoning. When the religious leaders brought her to Jesus to ask him what to do with her, they weren't puzzling over an apparent moral dilemma. They were trying to trap Jesus into contradicting the law so they could then have pretext to silence him as a lawbreaker. just like they'd caught this woman in bed with someone else's husband and they wanted to silence her. What did Jesus do? He had every right to say, yes, the law requires her to be stoned. Let me throw the first one, and let's teach this woman and all the onlookers a thing or two about good and bad. Instead, he said nothing. He knelt down and wrote in the dust with his finger. No one knows what he wrote, but we can infer what he was trying to communicate, because elsewhere Jesus is described as God's word, from the Greek logos, meaning not only a message, but also the governing principle in which all reality exists. The ground, the dust, represents the planet and all that it's made up of, including you and me. God was about to speak a message about what's important to him. He was about to show how this poor woman's situation should be seen in reality. So when Jesus stood up, he said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone at her." Reality check. Stunned silence. They all dropped their stones and left. The eldest went first. They'd lived long enough to know they had their own faults and they couldn't hide from them. The youngest went next. Yes, they too had a sense of right and wrong. The adulterer was left standing there with Jesus, the only one who had the right to stone her. And what did he say to her? "Woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you?" She replied that they'd left. Reality calls on us all to drop our stones and acknowledge our own guilt. Jesus' next words were a cataclysmic statement that undoes all the millennia of death which the fruit of that tree had poisoned our minds and lives. He said, "I don't condemn you either." The one man there who had the right to stone her would not do so. He saw the bigger picture. God was more interested in her life than in her death. His final statement to her was this: "Now go, and from now on, don't sin. Go your way, live your life. Don't commit adultery anymore, in thought or in deed." She knew she'd done wrong. Adultery never pays off. It always breaks hearts, it always breaks homes, and it always contributes to heartbreaking trends in society. You don't need me to point that out to you. When God decided to pronounce on her situation, he didn't excuse her wrongdoing, nor did he focus on it. Instead, he offered her a way forward. How would it be possible for her to sin no more? Sounds like a tall order. It is a tall order. He didn't tell her to go and relearn the law. She didn't need that. She needed something much greater. That something, that someone, was standing right in front of her. She'd met the person who was the solution. As Jesus said elsewhere, "I've not come to condemn the world, but to save it." He offered her life, and that life wasn't going to be found in mere morals. It was going to be found in abundance in him. To finish up, let me say that God is not a finger-wagging, idealistic moralist. He's a lover. His constant call to mankind is this: come to me, return to me, receive my life, and so know me, know my love, know one another, love one another. Yes, ever since our ancestors chose to take good and bad into their own hands, we've needed correcting on our viewpoints. At times I've needed to remember the Bible's words: husbands, love your wives and don't treat them with any harshness. Those exhortations, those rules in themselves can't change us. They can help us focus our behaviour, they can help us express the love we have for each other, but it's that love which is the engine and the fuel of our relationship. Most of all, they remind us that we need God. Every day we need God. They point us to the one whose love is what caused him to initiate the universe and to give each one of us life. They point us to the one whose power, if we will simply come to him, gives us the free gift of new birth into a new life, transforming us so we can truly live and so that we can live true. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Simon.
Okay. Thank you, John. So, I really enjoyed Peter's discourse. Really very stirring words from the heart. Now, I recognise some humanists here, and I'm sure there are some people who are not humanists, maybe live without religion. And what I say is not going to come to any surprise to you. It's probably more important that I talk about non-religious morality to people of religious faith. When I talk to religious groups or interfaith groups, the one thing they always want to know, the one thing that puzzles them, is how do you know right from wrong if you haven't got a Bible or a Quran or a Talmud? And even if you can work out sort of what's right and wrong, why do you bother to do it? Okay. So this evening, I'm going to talk about where non-religious people, like humanists, get their morals. And if possible at the end, if I have time, or during the discussion, we'll talk about what motivates us to do the right thing. It's one thing to know what the right thing to do is, another thing to actually do it. How can we actually persuade other people and ourselves to do the right thing? We'll come back to that later. So, how do we know right from wrong? How do we know anything? That's an area of science called epistemology. Now, most of us recognise that truth comes from two well-studied sources. What philosophers have called axiomatic truth and discovered truth, sometimes called analytical and synthetic or necessary and contingent. Okay, firstly, axiomatic truth. Axiomatic truth are things that have to be true. Their opposite is impossible. It consists of maths and logic and definition. So, 2 and 2 equals 4, because that's what 2 and 2 and the function, the addition function means. Definitions. Part of the definition of a dog is it's a mammal. Therefore, saying all dogs are mammals is axiomatic. The opposite's impossible. Logic. If I say I like all beer, okay, and Boddington's is a beer, then I like Boddington's. So that is propositional logic. It's axiomatically true. Now, in contrast, the other sort of truth, discovered truth, is very different. As a humanist, if I want to find out if something is true, I study that thing, I observe it, I investigate it, if necessary I do experiments. And that gives me a basic understanding of that thing, a hypothesis if you like. Then I look around for things that agree with my hypothesis. But much more importantly, I look around for things that disagree with it, that make me want to throw it away or at least change it. It's the constant testing and challenging of ideas that's so important in what we call the scientific method. And it's the way knowledge moves forward. Scientists have the humility to recognise that our discovered truth isn't necessarily the whole truth, but it's the best hypothesis so far, and it may change as we learn more. The humanists' view of knowledge is similar to what's called naturalism. I well remember when I first told my teenage children that I was a humanist and I told them about naturalism, and they were terrified because they got that muddled up with naturism. And they anticipated family nudist camp holidays. Anyway, nudism is not a big part in humanism, certainly not in Shropshire. Now, in philosophy, naturalism means the belief that only natural laws and natural spirits operate in the world, as opposed to supernatural or spiritual forces. We believe the universe can be explained by natural laws, many of which we've discovered, and the rest, at least in principle, are discoverable. We deny a second layer to existence inhabited by gods and ghosts and spirits. Now, you might be saying that discovered truth, the scientific method's pretty obvious, because we see around us all the day, every day, the effects of science, both the benefits and the problems. But science and discovered truth isn't the only way people look for the truth. Some people look for truth in sacred texts, or rely on their leaders, or priests, to tell them what's right and wrong, or good or bad. And this is referred to as revealed truth. Unlike the discovered truth of science, revealed truth is usually held to be absolutely true, so that new discoveries can't disprove it, and revealed truth doesn't change much over time. And whereas with discovered truth, it's the constant challenging and questioning that's so important, with revealed truth, criticism isn't always welcome. Now, there's another form of revealed truth that many religious people rely on, and that's personal revelation, an inner voice that informs or guides or comforts. Humanists experience these things. I experience these things. These experiences that are unexpected and unbidden, and sometimes very insightful. But we believe they come from our minds, from in here, not from some ultimate source of truth out there. So, religious revealed truth and scientific discovered truth are sometimes at odds. For example, humanists believe in evolution rather than creationism, science rather than mystery, critical thinking rather than blind faith, natural explanations rather than supernatural ones, understanding rather than prejudice, prejudging. Humanists make up their mind based on reason and evidence and compassion for our fellow men. We don't prejudge by starting with a sacred rule book. Science isn't just about the physical world. Nothing's off limit in our search for the truth. How our minds work and our brains work are studied by psychology and neuroscience, but also our personality, our consciousness, our free will, even our sense of religiosity and spirituality and morality can be studied and have been extensively studied. Okay, so that's enough about knowledge in general and the difference between revealed truth and discovered truth. Now, here's my first big question about morality. Are good and bad universal truths that apply throughout the universe, that are in some way separate from us? So, for example, would good and bad exist even if we didn't know about them, even if we didn't exist? Were good and bad present there before life started on this planet over 6 billion years ago? Now, I'll give you an example, an analogy. I look at a sunset, and it's beautiful. I eat a Marmite sandwich, and it's really, really tasty. You see where this is going. Okay. Is it the sunset that's really beautiful? Is the beauty of the sunset separate from me, a beauty intrinsic to the sunset? Even if no one saw it, would the sunset be beautiful? Marmite. Marmite has some easily verifiable properties. It's black and it's sticky and it has a totally wonderful taste. Now, is that taste, wonderful taste, is it an actual intrinsic property of Marmite, a universal truth about Marmite separate from human beings and their taste buds? I think not. So, you know the saying, beauty is in the mind of the beholder? It's in here that the sunset is beautiful. It's in here that the beauty is created. And Marmite is considered really tasty, or not, in here. So beauty is a human construct. And although most people agree about the beauty of sunsets, we don't all agree about Marmite. As a neurologist, I've seen patients with brain damage who can see and describe a sunset. And they know that it should be beautiful. But their brain damage prevents any experience or enjoyment or appreciation of beauty. Because beauty is a function of their brain, not in the sunset itself. Now, the idea that there are universal values out there that we have to find is known as realism. So I would say that beauty is non-realist because it's a human construct. It's made in here. It's actually made up in here. So in the same way, are good and bad out there separate from us, or for us to find, that would be the realist position, or are good and bad something that our extraordinarily complex, evolved brain has developed, a human construct like the beauty of the sunset or Marmite's wonderful taste? Now, the trouble is this. The idea that morality is something that comes out of our brains immediately rings alarm bells, understandably. If we each just make up what's right and wrong, isn't that the road to chaos and anarchy, the worst sort of moral relativism, a sort of Game of Thrones scenario? Anybody know what I mean? Most of you look puzzled. Never mind. Okay. It's what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes said would cause the life of man to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Of course, if each of us made up our own mind about right and wrong, and we all had different ideas, it would be a nightmare. If you thought it was fine to kill people and you didn't, if you thought it was fine to be honest and you thought it was fine to tell lies, it would be chaos. We'd be at each other's throats. But it's not like that. That is the fear of many people of faith and interfaith groups that I've spoken to. That's what scares those who believe in the realist or universal truth position. That's the fear behind the fact that humanism and atheism is illegal in over 30 countries and has the death sentence in 13 countries. Even Pope Benedict said humanists live in a moral vacuum. But it's not like that. It's not a nightmare. At the moment, over half the population of this country live without religion. And among young people, 18 to 24, school leavers, it's over 70% live without religion. And it's not Sodom and Gomorrah, even in central Shrewsbury on a Saturday night. Maybe a little bit of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, for the rest of my allotted time, I'm going to try and convince you that we actually agree, all of us agree with each other, about our moral values much more than you'd expect. And what's interesting is the moral values of non-religious people are actually very similar to the moral values of people with religion, particularly moderate religion. Now, my first evidence comes from scientific studies of what's known as positive psychology. Clinical psychology is the study of the mind when it goes wrong, when there are problems. Positive psychology is when our thoughts and mental processes go well. So positive psychology is about well-being, what makes us happy. So surveys among people of all races and cultures have shown a huge consensus about what are desirable character strengths and virtues. Very briefly, wisdom and knowledge, that gives you creativity, open-mindedness, love of learning, innovation. Courage, bravery, persistence, integrity. Humanity, love, kindness, social intelligence, justice, fairness, good leadership. Temperance, forgiveness, humility, self-control, not too much beer. Transcendence, a sense of beauty and excellence, a sense of awe and wonder, and of hope and humour. Now, I don't think many people would argue with those as character strengths and virtues, though we might disagree about which were the most important. They're not so different from the ancient virtues in Plato's Republic, or the iconic theological virtues of faith, hope, and love in 1 Corinthians 13, together with the later additional cardinal virtues of St. Ambrose. Now, my second source of evidence is based on results of research on human morality in a large number of academic centres throughout the world, published research. The earlier phenomenological studies by the positive psychologists, that's the descriptive studies, have been refined and extended. It's an area of research known as moral foundation theory, and it's shown that all races and cultures have basic moral values, and interestingly, that most of these moral values are seen in the higher animals as well. These moral values vary from person to person, just as everybody's not the same height or the same weight. So to a greater or lesser extent, everyone has a sense of love and compassion, some more, some less. Also a sense of fairness and justice. And both compassion and fairness are seen in animals. And of course in animals, who have little or no culture, these animals, the moral values are entirely inherited. So, also like animals, humans have a strong sense of hierarchy. And so, to a greater or lesser extent, we respect authority, leader of the pack, pecking order in birds. We have strong loyalties, even to those people who are kith rather than kin. And we have a strong sense of taboos, usually taboos about sex, prohibition of incest, or contamination taboos about food and hygiene, often manifest as a sense of innate disgust. So, these moral senses vary from person to person. So, for example, with empathic concern, there's a normal distribution. Okay, it's the number of people up here and the extent of empathy along here. Most people are in the middle. Some people are particularly empathic, more commonly women. Some people are rather deficient in empathy, more commonly men. Does that surprise you? Okay. Now, what causes this variation? Why doesn't everybody just have the same amount of empathy? Well, there can only be two causes. One is your genes, and the other is your environment, nature and nurture, or a combination of the two. Now, there have been a number of fairly robust studies that have looked at the extent of the variation that's due to genes. And this is based on concordance and twin studies. I'll explain it later to you if you're not familiar with it. And it gives a figure of about 50% of the variation in emotional empathy is due to your genes and about 40% for fairness. In other words, about half of the variation on moral values is due to our genes. Now, that's not surprising. In animals, the figure's almost 100%. And as we evolved into social animals and developed culture, when we passed on information to future generations, so during our social evolution, the extent, the contribution of the genetic component has fallen slightly, just as you'd expect. And this is not dissimilar to other complex skills we acquire. As a neurologist with an interest in cognitive neuropsychology, I'm familiar with the fact that when we're born, our brain has a number of built-in systems, like a new computer that comes loaded with Windows. So, for example, we're born with programs to learn language, although which language we learn depends on what languages we hear. In the same way, we're born with basic instinctive moral programs, though, like everything else, these innate morals vary from person to person, and obviously our upbringing fine-tunes them. Compassion, fairness, respect for authority, group loyalty and taboos, innate to a significant extent, but moulded by our experiences, our upbringing, nature and nurture working together. Now, psychologists can estimate where an individual is on the moral spectrum, and they refer to this as moral intelligence, a bit like IQ is cognitive intelligence, or emotional EQ is emotional intelligence, which is your ability to understand and express emotions. Now, I'll show you what I mean. When you're assessing somebody's moral intelligence, you often do a thought experiment. We'll try one on you. Okay. So, a man breaks into a pharmacy and steals drugs. Okay, it's a no-brainer. It's wrong, he'll probably get caught, he'll probably be punished. Even somebody with very little moral intelligence, like a psychopath, says he broke the law, he'll get into trouble. Now I'm going to change the story. He's stealing an anti-cancer drug for his wife, who's dying of cancer, because the chemist is charging £2,000 for a drug that only costs £20. This is just a story, okay? The man breaks in, steals the drug for his wife, leaves £40, which is more than the drug's worth, mends the window on the way out. Okay, so our gut intuition tells us that it's more complicated than simply right or wrong. For example, we have considerable compassion for the husband and, of course, his wife. And our sense of fairness is affronted by the appalling greed of the pharmacist. But, you know, we're also a little bit worried the pharmacist was robbed. And also, we don't have the idea that everybody can just take the law into their own hands. So these are our gut instincts. But the trouble about instincts is they're very prone to bias, selfish bias and self-interest. So we need some sort of objective way of assessing the rights and wrongs of a situation. And this is an area of philosophy called normative ethics. It's been around since the ancient Greeks. So I'm going to give you a very Reader's Digest, very fast whip through this scenario with normative ethics. Firstly, we might consider the outcomes for all involved, the husband, the pharmacist, the wife, society, and that's referred to as consequentialism, the utilitarian calculus that works out the maximum benefit for the most people. Secondly, partly as a foil to possible excesses of consequentialism, we have basic human rights, including a right not to be robbed. Human rights has a long history. Very important. Thirdly, you don't want to be robbed, so you shouldn't rob other people. That's called mutuality or the golden rule. The golden rule has been around for a very long time. No single religion has the first claim on it. In fact, the first reference to it is in Egyptian hieroglyphics 2,000 years BC. Fourth, there's a requirement in civilized societies to obey the law, to obey the social contract, even if you don't like the law. That's sort of called deontology. Anyway, lastly, and not least at all, you need to consider what's in the mind of the guy who broke in. Was he trying to do the wrong thing? Was he stealing drugs to sell to addicts? Or was he actually trying to do the right thing, to save his wife's life with minimum damage to other people? That's referred to as virtue ethics. Now, it really doesn't matter what you eventually decide about the rights and wrongs of this guy breaking in. It doesn't matter if you can't put names to these philosophical discussions I've mentioned. What's important is you all recognise the points I made. What's important is you recognise that it's complex. The complexity of the situation alters the rights and wrongs of it. So what humanists are saying here is that it's biology and culture that have created our moral sense rather than any religion giving us morality. Our natural moral instincts, for example, the golden rule, have often been adopted by religions, and that's one reason that moral values are similar in all the different religions. Now, my plan today was to explain how, for me and those like me who live without religion, our moral values originate from our shared ideas of good character and virtue, innate moral foundations modified by our unique reasoning ability, unique among animals. I have put forward, I hope, a reasoned and evidence-based account of a humanist view, but I haven't as yet directly compared my account to the moral origins of religious accounts. So let me address my last comments to Peter. Okay. Peter is someone I admire for his intelligence and his knowledge, not just of theology, but of philosophy and neuroscience. I also admire Peter for being a man who walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. He and his family worked as missionaries in Honduras, a very, very scary place. And he has dedicated his life to making the world a better place. But I say to Peter that a basic God-given moral principle such as thou shalt not steal is a good start. But you still need to reflect, just as we did in considering the case of the guy who broke into the pharmacy. Reflection using innate compassion, our sense of fairness and respect for authority, and our advanced moral reasoning. We humanists see no advantage in starting with an oversimple commandment such as thou shalt not steal. And stealing is one of the easier issues. Abortion, assisted dying, sexual orientation, animal welfare, genetic engineering. Humanists would say that these challenging issues are better studied and discussed using reason and evidence rather than by referring to sacred texts. So I say to Peter, close your Bible, stop seeking guidance from above, and work it out for yourself. You can do it.
Thank you, Simon. Now we have about 5 minutes break. You can stretch, you can use the toilets, etc., etc. Think of questions that you might like to ask. And when we have the questions, I think the way we'll do it is that we'll have a question first to one and then to the other. And so one of them will answer a particular question, and then the other just have the opportunity of adding to it. But that way we shall keep the answers and the questions reasonably short, to enable the many people who have questions to ask to be able to ask the questions. So relax, talk to your neighbour, stretch your legs for 5 minutes. Could I ask, please, a show of hands for the first question? The gentleman with the whitish hair at the back there. And to whom are you asking this?
To Simon.
To Simon? Yep.
Simon, my name's Ray Grant. It's about morality. I know that you brushed over evolution quite quickly in your intersection. As a neurologist, you spoke about the brain, and as you know, nobody knows the full workings of the brain and how brilliant it is. My concern is, are you saying that the brain is two-part question, by the way? The brain evolved; it wasn't designed.
The brain evolved, yes.
You feel it did, but you feel it wasn't designed, knowing that.
Not in the sense I think you mean.
Sorry.
No, it evolved.
It evolved. Right, well, then I'm going to ask you a second question then. There's a brilliant fighter jet called an F-35.
Oh, no.
It's relevant.
Okay.
If I were to say to you, that came as a result of an explosion in a breakers yard, when all the dust settled, there was a perfectly formed aircraft. Would you think I'm crazy?
Right, that's the question.
Okay. So I'm afraid this is a very, very old chestnut that's brought up on a fairly regular basis by creationists, and I do not want to discuss creationism now. Let us discuss the origins of morality. I'm very happy to see you another time and discuss this. I don't want to discuss that now.
You mentioned evolution, that's why I asked the question.
I'll just respond a little bit.
Yeah, let Peter have a word.
Yeah, I think it is relevant. Not that we're going to discuss creation and evolution tonight, but I do think there's a relevance to asking how everything began.
Right. Well, let's. I mean, hold on one moment. No. I have not called you, sir. I have not called you. Please sit down. Whatever is mentioned needs to be done in terms of the subject, the origin of morality. I think we must fix on that. So, could I ask now for a question for Peter?
Thank you for your talk, Peter. Very inspiring, very interesting.
Thank you.
Simon has said there are no axioms, no foundational beliefs, no stopping points, no buck stops here when it comes to understanding moral principles or moral knowledge or moral understandings. That these are a messy, evolving complex. Whereas it seems you would say, no, there is a foundational and axiomatic belief, and that is that the world and morality is created by a loving God. And you wouldn't say that that's something, you'll come back to me and say if I'm wrong, you wouldn't say, well, that's something that's open to proof or disprove. You'd say, if you don't hold to that axiomatic belief, then so much else will all come tumbling down. That the axioms are held in place by the belief systems of which they are the foundations.
So, sorry, what's the question?
So the question really is, is that a fair characterisation? And what do you understand of the humanist axiomatic position? Do you think the humanists have got one from your understanding as a Christian?
Yeah. I think that everyone bases their life on an axiom. And I think there are only two ultimate axioms. Naturalism, which Simon bases his life on, is the belief that, rather the lack of belief in anything outside the natural world. And theism is the belief that there is a designer, a creator. So naturalism is based on an axiom which is untestable. You can't test to show that all there is natural forces and natural events in the world. There's no test that could possibly do that. So naturalism is actually based on an assumption, and Christianity or theism is also based on an axiom, which is that there is a designer and creator. Can that be tested for? Probably not going to go into that in depth tonight, but there is evidence I think we can look at. If you're interested to study that further, I've written a booklet called God with a question mark. It's on the table over there. It's free. Just looking at some of the scientific and philosophical, psychological and experience-based clues. I like to call them clues towards there being, as Simon would describe it, a second layer of reality.
Simon, you want to add?
Just a very brief word. Yes, I mean, as a humanist, I don't know that there isn't a God. I have an open mind. If somebody produces good evidence, I'm happy to look at it. But so far, I think the evidence is singularly lacking. I keep an open mind.
Right. A question. Is there a lady who would like to ask a question? Thank you. Do you want to come to the microphone?
It's something about Simon referred to religious people using their religious books as rule books, and I read the Bible a lot. I don't see it as a rule book, and I just wondered whether Peter thought that is it supposed to be for Simon? Sorry.
No, you can ask whatever you like.
The rule book, the thing about the religious person getting their morals from a rule book. I do get my morals from the Bible, but not because it's a rule book, and I just wondered whether you have any connection with that.
Yeah, in my talk I was seeking to illustrate that the Bible is much more than a rule book, and it's designed to point us beyond rules and ways of living to, if you like, the author of life. But I'd be interested to hear Simon's response to that, what he perceives the Bible to be.
We come across moral dilemmas all the time, and there is no doubt that people look, not just Christians, but most religious people look in their sacred text for some sort of understanding. Sometimes there's quite explicit recommendations. Leviticus 20:13 is absolutely explicit about homosexuality. There's no wiggle room there for reinterpretation. If a man lieth with a man as he would with a woman, it is an abomination, and they shall die. Okay. So if you start with that, it gives you a slightly, I think, prejudiced attitude when you're trying to work out how in society we should live together and what we should accept and what we shouldn't accept. So I think that would be perhaps just one example, possibly an extreme example, but it shows that the situation does arise sometimes.
Right, thank you very much. A question now for Simon. The gentleman over there.
This is for the humanist gentleman.
Yeah.
Gentleman.
I think I go further than you in my acceptance of life. Do you accept that human beings are able to make decisions, either in what they think, say, or do?
Are you asking me whether I think we have free will?
Do you believe that humans have the will to make decisions, to make a will?
Yes, I would say, we certainly feel we do, yes, I would say we do.
Perhaps I would explain. I'm an evolutionary determinist.
Okay.
And I think morals have evolved exactly the same as everything else has. If we are an evolved species, which we are, we're in the kingdom of animals, but we're exactly the same as every other animal. Everything about us has evolved. And if we have evolved, morals are something that has evolved with us.
Okay. For those of you who didn't hear, let me just repeat this. This gentleman's an evolutionary biologist. It takes evolutionary and so basically what he's asking is whether I think that human morality is something that has evolved. Yes, it has. And the morality we've evolved has been during the time we've become social animals. It's terrible to think if we had all remained unsocial animals, living in just groups of 2 or 3, each person against every other, the sort of morals we might have. Fortunately, we've developed into social animals, and there's a huge amount of agreement about getting on with each other with compassion and fairness and respect for our parents and all the usual givens. And I think these are largely inherited, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on that question. You're an evolutionary determinist, so you acknowledge that if there's no creator, then we are the product of our genes and our DNA, and nothing more.
No, not entirely. That is obviously...
And our culture as well, including our culture. So there's a nature and there's a nurture, right? But we're effectively determined beings. You said you're a determinist, so presumably you believe that our decisions are conditioned.
I don't have any beliefs at all. I have what you would explain as logic.
Okay. Well, I won't try and characterise your beliefs then, because I need a longer discussion on that. But I will say this. If you're an atheist, if you're a naturalist, ultimately you have to acknowledge that you have no free will, because you are the product of your genes and your environment. And every decision that, as Simon says, you feel you are making is actually conditioned by your genes and your environment. And Richard Dawkins put it very succinctly when he said that we're merely dancing to the tune of our DNA. So that's the view. And I asked Simon a few years ago, he invited me to a talk which he did about humanism. It was very well attended. And so I went to see him later on and I said, Simon, it was great to see so many people at your talk. And he agreed. I said, did anyone actually choose to come? And he laughed, because he knows. He knows. He knows that on naturalism, no one chose to come. They felt that they were choosing that they came, but something in the environment and the conditioning and the upbringing and the DNA conspired to bring you here tonight. On Christianity, free will is a reality. We're given a gift by God to make choices that are real, live, moral, and other choices.
Just a few words.
Okay, yeah, I mean, Peter and I are not so far apart here. I mean, it seems like we've got free will. I think we have free will like any very, very complex organism will seem to. If you had a computer of the same complexity, it would think it had free will as well. So, yeah, we have free will. We are able to make decisions. It certainly seems like that. So we're not so far apart.
Sorry, I have to come back on that. Listen to the words, seem to, think we have, feel we have.
Yes, over there.
Thank you. I've got one question for Simon and one question for Peter.
Well, I think one question.
In relation to evolutionary, Peter, do you think moral principles? I know you say, evolutionary is linked with naturalism and science now, but I put it this way: do you think moral principles, as far as religion is concerned, is progressive or absolute and unchangeable?
Good point.
Yeah, I think we're given an innate sense of right and wrong, and as I said in my talk, that was given to us for a simple reason, that we would remain oriented to God, and that in a relationship with God we would naturally know what to do and what not to do. We weren't designed to have to think through lists of do's and don'ts and face ethical dilemmas such as we do. As to whether our current moral consciousness is put there completely by God or is something that's evolved along the way, I tend to think it's both. I tend to think that God placed, once we decided to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, or our ancestors did, God placed within us the consciousness of do not murder, do not steal, etc. Some of that, though, came through experience. Look at Cain murdering Abel. Before Cain murdered Abel, there was no command, do not murder. That came later. So my shortest answer would be it's both.
Simon, do you want to add?
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. The lady over there?
Hi. As this society is becoming more and more godless as such, do you think it's becoming better or worse? I've got children, if no one believes in God as it's going.
Who are you asking?
Anyone, I mean, it's a big question.
Which of you want to take that?
You go. It's your turn. Oh, is it my turn? Okay. So it is true that certainly in this country we're becoming less religious. I said earlier that over 53% of the country overall are non-religious, and over 70% of young people. And among Christians, people who call themselves Christians, less than half believe that Jesus was a real person who died, came back to life, and was the Son of God, which is the sort of sine qua non for Christianity. So we're becoming a progressively secular country, but it hasn't yet turned to Sodom and Gomorrah. Also, we know from fairly extensive studies, like those by Steven Pinker, that the world has been getting better over the last few hundred years since the Enlightenment. And it's got better for a variety of reasons, but religion is not one of them. For example, the Church of England opposed the abolition of slavery. They opposed women's rights. They opposed homosexualism. In time, they were dragged by the rest of the country into a more reasonable stance. But I don't think the reason the world has got better is because of religion. I'm not saying it's got better because of lack of religion. I think it's more that people are using their compassion, their empathy, their sense of fairness, their wish to create a better society, regardless of whether they're religious or not.
Yeah, I think it's hard to judge if things are getting better or worse. It depends from what perspective you look. I would point out, though, Simon, that you mentioned that the Church of England opposed the abolition of slavery. But as anyone here who knows about the history of the abolition of slavery in England knows, that was almost single-handedly spearheaded by William Wilberforce. And he did it because of his Christianity. And he had conversations with was it William Pitt the Younger or the Elder, who was Prime Minister? The Younger. And Wilberforce wanted to leave, or not go into politics, or leave politics, in order to become a preacher. And William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister, persuaded him to stay in politics and told him, even though I don't think William Pitt was a Christian, he told him that you will better serve God in politics, moving forward with your desire to see slavery abolished in this country, than if you become a preacher. So if you're not familiar with the history on that, please research it. There's a very good film. It's called Amazing Grace. It was made a few years ago, that goes into depth on the history of that. And unlike a lot of Hollywood revisionism, it's quite true to the facts. So please do some research. Slavery was abolished in this country because of the lifelong work of a man who based his life on Christian principles.
John, can you say something about that? You know a lot about that.
Well, certainly Wilberforce was very crucial. Of course, the slaves themselves and their agitation was also very important. And Townsend, what's the name of the man? The key character was Townsend.
Cooper?
No, it's all right. I've forgotten the name. But the Quakers were crucial as well. And then the particular man who was asked to write an essay for a Greek prize on whether in Cambridge, whether or not slavery ought to be allowed. And he wrote his essay in Greek and won the prize. And riding back on his horse, he suddenly thought, well, if I can win a prize for this, perhaps I ought to do something about it. And spent his rest of... He was really the person, I wish I could remember his name, who agitated and got Wilberforce to do things. Okay, a question to Peter now, the lady over there.
I'm quite interested, Peter, because you've very much looked at your religion, and then Simon's looked at humanism. But it seems there's an awful lot of religion that is of a very different sort. That there's religion, even within Christianity, there's religions that don't believe in a creator, intelligent God, and there's other religions, not Christianity, that either do or don't. And I'm wondering where you feel they fit into the.
Are you asking about non-Christian religion, or are you asking about variations within Christian denominations?
The religions that either don't believe in a...
Okay, because I think they're two separate issues. So when it comes to non-Christian religions, I like what C.S. Lewis said. He said that every religion has a grain of truth in it. I think if you look at Islam, and I say this as a Christian, Muslims believe there's one God, which is true. Muslims believe that God is powerful, which is true. And Muslims believe, at least on those that follow faithful interpretations of the Quran, that you should be hospitable, which is true. Those are all truths. We could look at other religions and draw similar, I'd call them grains of truth, out from them. But the truth is found in the person of Jesus. And there's a lot that could be said about that, but I'll point out one fact about Jesus. You won't find another world religion that teaches that you should love your enemies and pray for your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, and that whose leader, whose initiator, demonstrated that. And Jesus did. And that's unique to Christianity, especially when you tie it in with the fact that it doesn't just give the command, but as I was talking in my talk earlier, it's not that we're just given the command, love your enemies. For all who turn to Jesus, the power is given to enable you to do that. So that's other religions. And then briefly you asked about Christian denominations and different views within Christianity. I think that humility is a really important quality, the ability to listen to others and to hear their viewpoint and to discuss and seek truth together. And a lot of what you see happening within Christianity is that process. The foundations are shared in common, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he died, that he rose from the dead, etc. But within on that foundation, there's a lot of discussion, and I think that's a healthy thing.
Do you want to add?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Now, question for Simon, the young gentleman there.
My question would be on your position as an anti-realist.
Say it again.
Your position as an anti-realist.
Yes.
So morals would be in the mind of the person who has them, as such. If that's the case, then right or wrong in a society or in a world would be determined by the consensus of opinion. If that's the case, if you had a world in which, for example, as I think Peter Singer suggests, who is an atheist, that parents should be allowed to kill their child up to the age of 1.5, and if a society or even a world agreed on this, and they thought that this was the morally right thing for them to do, would that therefore mean that it was morally right, since morals only exist in the minds of people?
This is a really fascinating question. Supposing we'd evolved differently, and we all thought something different, like it's fine to kill your kids. Sometimes anyway. Yeah.
Or parents.
Or parents. So it's fascinating, and it's a wonderful sort of science fiction idea. I love science fiction. I think it tells us a lot. Gulliver's Travels, Erewhon, Ursula Le Guin. If you haven't read her, she's a science fiction writer who writes about issues like this. Supposing we'd evolved differently with different moral values, and we all agreed about them, what sort of world would that be like? Yes, fascinating, but it isn't like that. We have the world we have, and we agree largely about how we should behave. We don't always do it. And in my final summing up at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is that increases our chances of doing the right thing. You'll have to wait.
So one more question, and this is to Peter, the lady over there. That's you.
Hi, this is a question for both of you, really. You said at the beginning that you have similar morals to my question is really, do you think it matters? Do you think that having your moral values from religion is better than inherently more moral, getting your morals to reasoning? Or does it not matter if the outcome is the same?
Okay, thank you. So you're saying that the statement was made that Simon and I share many of our moral values in common. So does it matter whether we get those from religion or non-religion? Is that the question? Yeah. Well, let's clarify. We share common values in many of the basic areas. We agree on that love and compassion and fairness and tolerance, etc., are right. We don't agree on how that should play out in some areas. And we also don't agree on the foundation for those moral values. As Simon pointed out earlier, he believes that morals are a human construct that are based on what's going on in your mind. On my view, I believe that morals are not based on what's going on in your mind. They're based on the character of God who created the universe. Now, in our minds, we respond to God or we respond to situations and make moral judgments, but that doesn't mean we're creating the morals in our mind. So I think it does matter where we get them from, ultimately.
If there is a God of the kind Peter describes, then he is absolutely right in all respects.
Right, and I think the cue for you to move to your summing up.
Oh, right, okay. So, I wish I'd thought about this a bit more. Right. I can recommend a book by a psychologist and philosopher called Peter Singer called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he discusses...
No. Wrong type.
The better...
No, not by Peter Singer.
Stephen Pinker. Thank you, John. It's very irritating when your older brother puts you right. Stephen Pinker. It even says Stephen Pinker here. Okay. And what are the forces that have kept us on the straight and narrow? And he looks at things within society. For example, sort of cosmopolitanism, so that we have experienced people from different cultures and different places, so we have a wider circle of empathy. He talks about commerce. So we have a positive sum gain to cooperate. He talks about the escalator of reason, where we have institutions that increase the amount we reason and so on. But he also talks about individual changes. We have an increased moral sense, partly innate, partly through our culture, and that's important. We have self-control, which basically means we consider the outcome of our actions and then modify them accordingly. We have the faculty of reason, which allows us to reflect, as we did, for example, on the guy breaking into the pharmacy. But last, but probably the most important, is empathy. Now, let me just explain why this is important. Many of our behavioural controls are carrot and stick, sometimes mutual benefit and sometimes rational reflection, but carrot and stick is one of the main ones. But in recent years, there's been a great emphasis on the importance of empathy, which leads people to do the right thing, not because they know it's right and they ought to do it, not because they're going to be rewarded or punished, but because they want to do it, because they feel it in here. So one of the big questions is, can we increase empathy? And I'm pleased to say the evidence is overwhelmingly that we can. I would refer you to researchers like Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, who's Sacha Baron-Cohen's cousin, Professor of Psychology at Oxford. He has shown that empathy can be increased even in people who are severely deficient in empathy, for example, people with severe autism. But even within the normal range, you can increase people's emotional, their empathic concern. And this is something I do. I teach empathic skills to medical students. You can ask me later how. Many religions put the role of empathy and compassion central to their faith. I did Buddhist meditation for a while, and you learn to empathise with people you love. That's not difficult. And then later with people you're sort of indifferent to, and later you empathise with people you'd normally find it very difficult to at all. A notable person in the field of empathy is Karen Armstrong. Somebody was talking about her earlier, who won the TED Prize and set up the Charter of Compassion with other like-minded worthies such as the Dalai Lama. Her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, it's on the side over there, shows how individual empathy can be enhanced. And actually in Shrewsbury we're lucky to have Professor Patrick Petroni, who single-handedly has set up the Darwin International Institute for the Study of Compassion. He was going to come tonight, but he emailed me to say he's still in America fundraising. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about, I've been talking to Peter and my brother John about this, empathic concern, which has been very well categorised and studied by psychologists and neuroscientists, empathic concern leads us to want to do the right thing. And in some ways, that's similar to Christian love, as described in 1 Corinthians 13. And now abideth faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. Charity, caritas, in the original Greek, of course, agape. Now, Christian love is quite a complex theological virtue. Orthodox theology says that the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, cannot be achieved without the grace of God. And it's a two-way thing. It's a love of God for you and you for your fellow man, and they have to go hand in hand. And even quite recently, Bishop Rachel Trowick of Gloucester, a newly appointed bishop, stated, you cannot love unless you've experienced the unconditional love of God, which, okay. I reckon I can love my fellow man without help from above, though occasionally it's not easy to love some people, but it's worth the effort. And I think one of the things I most admire about my Christian friends is this aspect of their faith, their Christian love, that leads them not just to do what is right because it's right, but they want to do it in their heart. But I don't think you need to be religious to be able to do that. It's not easy, but it's worth making the effort. I'm happy to concede that in years gone by, possibly to some extent now, religion has provided a powerful motivator for people doing the right thing. I think moral values have come from human beings themselves, and I think religions have actually adapted those into their own faiths, which is the reason why most faiths believe in the golden rule and being nice and the usual stuff. But I think what the main purpose of religions in years gone by has been a motivator, partly carrot and stick, heaven and hell. Even Galileo said that the sun went round the earth rather than be burnt at the stake. It's a powerful motivator. But I think the other great thing that many religions have given us, particularly Christianity, is this concept of increasing your empathy and feeling the love for other people, impassionate concern is what I call it, for other people. So that's something I admire about my Christian colleagues.
Simon reminded us of the saying that beauty is in the mind of the beholder. He said that it's in here that the sunset's beauty is created, and that Marmite is considered really tasty or not. So beauty is a human construct. On Simon's view, then, the sunset has no inherent beauty, and Marmite has no inherent good taste. Sorry. But the crucial point is he made morality equivalent to our ability to perceive beauty or to taste Marmite. In other words, he's saying that morality has no inherent goodness. It's all a matter of perception. I'm afraid, Simon, this is a subtle but significant category error. Beauty and taste are not equivalent to morals. I prefer orange sunsets to red ones, or I prefer honey to Marmite, is not equivalent to I will be kind to children, not cruel to them. Morals are not about aesthetics, I'll look better if I'm kind, and they're not about taste. I feel better about being kind, not cruel. Morals are about duties. If I see a child knocked down by a hit-and-run driver, and there's no one around more competent than me to help them, I must go and help. I have a duty to do so. It's not about aesthetics, will I mess up my clothes? It's not about taste, do I really feel like helping accident victims today or not? It's about duty, I must. And so the question comes down to this, where does duty come from? Now, if we go with the naturalist explanation, which would be Simon's, we would have to agree once again with our friend Richard Dawkins, that at bottom there is no good, no evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. Once again, we're dancing to the tune of our DNA. But we all know that to do right is a must. It's not a preference. Morality isn't equivalent to taste or aesthetics. Morals are more than this, and therefore the naturalist approach fails on that point. So what's the Christian view? Well, it's rooted in God. God is love. Love is a relational thing. You can't love unless there's someone or some being to love. And God's purposes are therefore all about goodness, faithfulness, kindness, justice, truth, within relationships. We're all made in God's image. That's why we all have equal value, regardless of who we are. And we're made to relate to God and each other and all of his creation with genuine and appropriate love. And that's why morals aren't about taste or preference. They're about duty. We're made in God's image, and so we have a duty to do what's right, a duty to love. And that surely is a privilege, to have that kind of duty. It's a duty and it's a privilege that humanists, I think, are seeking to fulfill. Well done. It's a noble aspiration. But do remember the source. In Christianity, the noble moral aspirations of humanism can be fully realized. Christianity is the logical next step. It'll give you a foundation for your morals. Not just to a fuller philosophy on morals or life, but to a life actually lived in all its fullness. And this is the life that Jesus came to give. And I want to turn my final comments directly to Simon. Simon, you're a man who loves puzzles, both making them and solving them. And Simon knows, because I sent him this week, that the Bible says, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, it is the glory of kings to search it out. So as both a puzzle maker and a puzzle solver, Simon, that seems to make you both a god and a king. But I'm sure you don't want to be worshipped.
Oh, I don't know.
So you'll be relieved. You'll be relieved to know, because I know you have more humility than you give on, you'll be relieved to know the Bible doesn't accord you godlike status, but it does say you, like all of us, are made in the image and likeness of God, God who is the original and best puzzle maker. Very grateful to you tonight for sharing with us some of what you've learnt from psychology, neurology and philosophy about the unbelievably rich and complex world of the human mind. It's amazing to gain more insight on how it works, even though we're only at the edges of such a puzzle, and much of it remains a mystery. This puzzle of humanity, has a puzzle maker as well. You rightly say, Simon, that the human brain comes pre-programmed with moral intuition, along with so many other life-giving functions. The program has a programmer. The mind has a maker. Finally, very finally, in searching out the puzzle, Simon, I would encourage you to look at the Bible in a new light. It's more than a manual of morals. Take your example of the thief who stole the drugs from the pharmacy. You spoke to us about how it's important to be morally sophisticated in assessing what happened there. Well, let's look to how the Bible would assess that. The 8th commandment is do not steal. There you go, normative ethics, basic norms of behaviour. Then in his book of the Proverbs, King Solomon says this: people do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his appetite when he's hungry. There you go, virtue ethics. Solomon goes on to say, but if he's caught, he will pay sevenfold. He will give all the goods of his house. That's deontology for you. Laws are there for a reason, they must be obeyed. Then Solomon goes on. He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. A nod towards consequentialism, I think. And all in the biblical framework, which includes, if you read the whole thing and don't take verses out of context, the biblical framework which includes human rights, based on our equal worth, all being made in the image and likeness of God, and of course it includes the good old golden rule. Taken together, that sounds like what you describe as moral sophistication. But of course the Bible goes further because God goes further than morals. Having given all the moral instruction, helping us face the fact of how we've fallen short of what's good, God sends his Son, not as a rule giver, but as a remedy. In the cross of Jesus, mercy triumphs over judgment. In the cross of Jesus, wrongdoing is acknowledged and paid for by him on our behalf, and forgiveness and new life are offered to all. So, Simon, you suggested I close my Bible. I'm truly glad that you don't want me to settle for a rule book. Humanity was made for so much more than that. Your comment actually reminds me of something Jesus said to the religious leaders. He said this to them: you search the Bible, the scriptures, thinking that you'll find life in them, and indeed they testify of me. In other words, the book points beyond itself to the person. Then he said, yet you refuse to come to me so you can have life. Life, not reading, but a relationship. Not a list of morals, but a life lived in the light and love and power and beauty of a relationship with the great puzzle maker. So to leave you with some words from Jesus, Simon, he said this: come to me and you will find rest. Jesus is the missing piece of your puzzle, and you can know him. Thank you.
We owe a lot to the two speakers tonight because of their respect for one another, their attention to the subject, and to the different viewpoints that they have given, which sometimes cross over and sometimes don't. And I believe that that's a help to us. So thank you to Simon, thank you to Peter, thank you to all of you, particularly those who were standing, and good night.